Now, let's get straight stuck in to our big top story this morning. The Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, will question the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, about the force's response to incidents during a pro-Palestinian protest in London this weekend.
Yes, she'll challenge the officers' decision to take no action when they heard a jihad chant, insisting that there can be no place for incitement to hatred or violence on UK streets.
Well, joining us in the studio now is the political commentator Piers Pottinger, and this is a pretty stark contrast, I suppose. On the one hand, a Home Secretary who's saying what we heard is not acceptable, and on the other hand, the Metropolitan Police that has almost been making excuses on social media, some might say, for some of what we heard.
Yes, I think the Metropolitan Police are in a bit of a quandary. They also, at the weekend, stopped a march of 30,000 people supporting Israel in Golders Green, which was, has understandably really upset the Jewish community. They can't be seen to be taking sides in this dreadful conflict. And for Suella Braverman is quite right to speak to Sir Mark Rowley, who himself produced a report back in 2021. He actually produced it about dealing with extremism in demonstrations. And the problem is the law is, I think it's hard to... Asking the police constantly to interpret the finer points of law, particularly when it comes to verbal outbursts, is very, very tricky. The police are actually trained to catch burglars, although they might have forgotten that, and getting them in. They are in a difficult position. I accept that, but I think Suella Braverman is right, because there is a bit of a powder keg, not just in Gaza, but all over the world at the moment. We've been seeing some terrible incidents in America, some terrible incidents in France, and one or two in this country already. And it is a very frightening time for the world.
Yes, The Guardian are reporting that the government was warned, and this was in a report Rowley produced, that current legislation contains gaps amounting to, in quotes, a gaping chasm allowing extremists to operate with impunity. Is this a problem with the law rather than the police?
Well, as I think I intimated there, I think that the law isn't as clear as it could be. And we're also asking the police to play semantics and define the use of language. And I mean, that's a very tricky thing to do, particularly in the heat of the moment. Although I would have thought shouting jihad was pretty provocative in the current climate.
I mean, Tom, it was quite remarkable that the Met Police issued a statement on Twitter, on social media, saying, oh, jihad has many meanings.
It can be interpreted in different ways, that we've got specialist officers looking into this. They were interpreting different flags. There was a flag that looked rather a lot like the flag of ISIS, but the Met Police replied saying, no, this is a separate subsect of radical Islamist ideology that wasn't specifically ISIS or something else. It could have been interpreted in a different way. I wonder, when it comes to looking at the specifics of whether or not this flag is one flag or another, whether jihad might be interpreted as a call for actual war or spiritual war or whatever it might be, does that matter when ultimately what people will interpret from these symbols is very different?
Yes, I mean, you're right, Tom, of course. It's what people will interpret. And the fact that we're discussing this semantics is, again, it just plays into the hands of Hamas. Hamas have got the world exactly where they want, not just Israel, boxed in a terrible situation after the appalling atrocities inflicted on them by the terrorists, but also they've got the West not knowing which way to turn, who to support, and looking very weak and feeble. Meanwhile, the Ukraine war continues. Putin and Xi in China are rubbing their hands with glee, because the West, I'm afraid to say, has never looked weaker in my lifetime than it is at the moment. And it's terrifying. And anything we can do to calm the situation down here, I think Suella Braverman is doing the right thing. But again, I go back to the point is that, you know, we shouldn't be arguing about the interpretation of words. We should be clearly... These people were clearly advocating the end of Israel in that demonstration. clearly. And that is wrong, and that is illegal, and shouldn't be allowed.
I believe one of the men who was pictured waving one of these Islamist flags, I'm not sure if it was Hizb ut-Tahrir, that Islamist group, or another, he has been arrested. People obviously, the police obviously found out who he was. But Tom sent me an article this morning, and it's called 12 Things More Arrestable Than Calling for Jihad. And they include things like silently praying near an abortion clinic, misgendering someone in public, calling someone a lesbian, burning a Quran, and it goes on, just highlighting perhaps how the police have not got this one right.
Well, I mean, at the weekend we heard that the Labour Party are considering introducing legislation, should they win the next election, to give people 2 years in prison if they misgender someone, as you've just mentioned there. I mean, what kind of world do we live in? Let's get down to reality. People are being slaughtered in a terrible war that is expanding by the minute. That is the number one priority for the whole world at the moment to sort out. And pretending that the terrorist activities of Hamas didn't happen, as some people still do, is extraordinary, wrong, and should be called out at every opportunity.
I think sometimes protests like these can be very difficult for people who might be of a sort of free speech inclination to sort of square with their own ideology, because clearly in the United States of America you can say horrendous things on a protest. You can picket the funeral of a soldier, and that's your First Amendment right. We don't have those same rights mirrored in the United Kingdom. I suppose the way that I think about it is looking at that list that Emily read out there in the Critic magazine today of these equivalent, perhaps, offences. People have been arrested for malicious communications, of making poor taste jokes in WhatsApp groups. And if that's the level of what the police are doing on the one hand, you'd think that you'd almost expect there to be a sort of balance, a concurrency with protests like this. Perhaps there hasn't been a level playing field in how some of this law is applied.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think for Sir Mark Rowley, Metropolitan Police Commissioner, he's got a very difficult task to apply the law across the board. And when you're in a situation as emotive as this one we're in at the moment, it's even harder for them. And, you know, as I say, the police are meant to be out there catching genuine criminals, instead of which they're having to debate whether the jihad was actually inciting violence or not. And I mean, this is a kind of judgment they shouldn't be asked to make.
Well, this is, you know, the concern that's deeper than this is, why are there people on our streets doing this? What's gone wrong in our society to allow this type of extremism? Because that's what it is. More difficult when it comes to chants, like from the river to the sea. I mean, if you've got a clearly anti-Semitic placard, or you're chanting for jihad, or you've got something calling on Muslim armies to rise, that should be, I think, a little bit more clear-cut in terms of the interpretation. Chants like from the river to the sea, when you have hundreds chanting that, if not thousands, very difficult with that free speech, as Tom was saying.
And yet that is clearly a chant that is saying there is no space for the state of Israel in that part of the Middle East. From the Jordan to the Mediterranean, it should only be Palestine. There shouldn't be a Jewish state.
People should be reminded of the Hamas Covenant or Charter from 1988, which is still in existence, and it's still their mantra. And if you read that, it is one prime objective, and that is the annihilation of Israel, the complete destruction of Israel. And the emotive language, I mean, Netanyahu, not very popular in his own country, himself a very controversial and has had a very bad time becoming back as Prime Minister. And now, I mean, he's using the most incredibly emotive language too about wiping out the Lebanon, and using such strong language that, I mean, this is the most frightening worldwide situation, certainly in my lifetime.
And certainly, as you alluded to earlier, the links between Hamas, Hezbollah and Iran,
absolutely.
the links between Iran and Russia in Ukraine, and all tying back to China too. We're seeing, it's often spoken about as if we're heading towards a multipolar world.
Well,
but perhaps we're heading to a bipolar world.
Well,
of
also
the free world and the autocracies.
Yeah, and Putin is thinking of is talking about getting the global south to support Hamas as well, and which is again very worrying. That's mostly the African countries and Asian countries, and they're using this opportunity. They see the West as very weak at the moment. We've got a very frail and very weak appearing US president who referred to Hamas as the other team. Absolutely.
That was remarkable.
Extraordinary. And you also have a weak Rishi Sunak, who looks as though he won't be in power in a year's time. The West is in its most vulnerable position.
And yet, you have in the US presidency right now an administration that wants to pass $100 billion of aid to Israel and to Ukraine to push back against this stuff. Perhaps the weaker point would be if the Democrats lose the White House and no longer is billions in US aid funding the effort of the Israelis and the Ukrainians.
Yeah, well, that's a real danger. I mean, the thought of Trump coming back as president is terrifying, quite frankly, in this kind of worldwide situation, because you have no idea what he might do. But don't
and of
forget,
course, supporters of Trump would say that's his advantage, that he's such a maverick and that might scare people away.
Well,
but of course, detractors would say that that's a terrible position to be in.
Well, some people go as far as to say that this wouldn't be happening if Trump was in power.
But don't forget that the Democrats also lessened all the sanctions on Iran and freed up money for them from Iraq, which enabled them to fund Hamas. We are also, of course, beholden to Qatar, because Qatar is such a big investor in this country. And we do so much business with not only Qatar, but most of the Arab states. And so a lot of people would wonder why the leader of a terrorist organization is operating in plain sight in Qatar, not even hidden. I mean, he's got a public office, he appears on television, and we regard Qatar as an ally, yet they are harboring the leader of the most terrifying organization in the world at the moment.
Just finally on this, before we move on to matters a little closer to home, was it a good thing for Rishi Sunak to go across to the Middle East to meet the Prime Minister of Israel, the King of Jordan, the leader of the Palestinian Authority, the President of Egypt? I mean, he seems to have had more of a successful trip in terms of meetings than Joe Biden did.
Yes. Well, I think partly because Rishi Sunak is obviously younger and fitter and is able to do more meetings. Biden has a very restricted schedule. Normally, he doesn't put in the hours that many previous presidents have done, because he is so frail and he does say the wrong things and goes off script and people have no idea what he's saying. In fact, neither does he. I mean, it's very worrying to have the leader of the Western world, the commander-in-chief, being so frail and so, quite frankly, really lacking in the strength to grasp this properly. And of course, in the past, we would have had the great Henry Kissinger flying around sorting this out. But people keep saying we should sort this out by diplomacy. You can't sort out Hamas by diplomacy. They don't want to be sorted out. They're in a position they've planned clearly for years. They've got to a fantastic position from their point of view, and they're going to get the most out of it. Unless, and I'm afraid, I fear that this the escalation in violence which we're seeing already today. And there's a press conference from the Israeli government today showing the horrors of Hamas to bring the Western journalists up to speed as to what actually happened, to remind them of the horrors, because they seem to have forgotten about that. But I mean, when you're getting down to showing videos of the horrors of war to journalists, I mean, this is really grim stuff. And a lot of people are too young to remember the previous war. I was born just after the Second World War. But those people who are still alive who remember the horrors of war will be shuddering at the moment.
Isn't it eerie that after the Second World War, the BBC and other television cameras were sent in to concentration camps.
Yes.
And they filmed the horrors there because people wouldn't believe it.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
are we seeing the same thing in Israel today?
I think there is a bit of that. And I mean, I think the other problem with social media we have now is that so much fake news flies around, and it's deliberate. Hamas are not just masters of terrorist acts. They're masters of media manipulation, as they've shown, by very quickly jumping on the attack on the hospital that they blamed immediately on the Israelis when it wasn't them. I think everyone now accepts it was a misfired Hamas rocket. But they saw this as an opportunity, and they managed to turn world opinion against the Israelis in a matter of seconds.
Incredibly quickly.
It's very, very
quickly.
frightening.
Shall we... Well, it seems relatively minor, but shoplifting is a massive issue in this country, and it seems to be getting worse by the day. The government is set to announce a zero-tolerance plan to sort it all out.
Good. Well, I mean, that's marvellous. And let's just hope the police actually arrest some of the shoplifters. I mean, the government can make these wonderful pronouncements, but in reality, the execution, catching these criminals, and they are criminals because they're stealing, catching these criminals doesn't seem to happen. I mean, that no burglaries. I mean, in my street in London, we've had my own car has been broken into 3 times in the last fortnight. 2 cars have been stolen in the last week, and the police just say, you ring them up and they say, right, thank you very much. Nothing happens. So the problem is we don't have the resources to catch these shoplifters, and they know it.
Well, Piers Pottinger, on that bright and cheery note, we thank you for reviewing those 2 big stories there this morning.